Welcome, and thank you so much for joining the World Affairs Councils of Connecticut and World Affairs Councils across the nation today for a special election edition of State of the World. So today's structure, it's a special edition. We're going to kick off with a conversation with World Affairs Council leaders from across the nation, moderated by Megan Tory, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut. We're joined today by Dellashon DiCresce from the World Affairs Council of Detroit in Michigan, Jim Falk from the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth in Texas, Tim Horgan from the World Affairs Councils of New Hampshire, Matthew Hughes, the International Relations Council out of Kansas City, Missouri, Derrick Olsen of WorldOregon in Portland, Oregon, Patrick Terrien, Columbus Council on World Affairs out of Ohio, and Zhao, World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. We're thrilled everyone can join us today. Thank you so much. And now let's get started. I'll turn it over to Megan Tory, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As a World Affairs Council, when we were getting ready, to look at the week before an election, we really wanted to make sure that we did something that was interactive and impactful. And I know that all of you have heard me speak about the network that we have of World Affairs Councils around the country, and we thought this was a perfect opportunity for you to meet some of the council leaders from around the country and to see what's going on the ground. I know here in Connecticut, we're predictably a pretty blue state, but I know that there are members in our community that there's a lot of anxiety around this election. I know in particular, our members have been telling us that they really care a lot or are concerned a lot about perhaps election interference or disinformation. And for example, even just on the Facebook post for this event, we had about a 1 to 42 response rate versus a 1 to 2 response rate. That means that, 1 to every 42 people sort of registered. So what that tells us is that there are a lot of bots looking at this event. So there's a lot going on. But I'm so grateful and so thankful to all of my counterparts and colleagues around the country who I have so much respect for, who I know are in the trenches day in, day out, working with their communities. But I want to jump right into this conversation, and I want to take a look at what's going on in councils and communities around the country. And I think I'm going to start in Texas with you, Mr. Falk. And while I have the opportunity, I want to say thank you for everything that you've done in the council system. I know that you are moving on to bigger and better things at the end of this year, but you have been such a pillar and such a leader in our council system. Thank you so much. Jim, Texas, there's a lot going on in Texas.
Well, first, Megan, it's great to see everybody, and thank you. I don't know if I'm moving off to anything bigger or better, because it's been such a joy and privilege to work with the councils, and I suspect I will still be involved in some way. And as you can tell, I'm not in Texas. I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico. But Texas is very interesting right now because it is not yet quite on that list of battleground states, but oh, it's so very close. The recent polls from the New York Times show that Trump has a lead of around 4%, which is really within the margin of error. University of Houston came out with a poll just yesterday at about the same level. Yes, just about a week ago, I had the privilege of moderating a debate with Frank Luntz and David Plouffe. And the question that came out of the audience was, when will Texas turn blue? And the answer that they gave was not yet, but probably in 4 years. And one of the main reasons for that is that Texas is the beneficiary of getting so many jobs. So many people are migrating to Texas. In fact, there are now 1.6 million more people planning to vote, registered to vote in 2020 versus 2016. And most of these people are living in urban areas. So while the rural vote, especially among uneducated white men, sorry guys, is still very much in support of President Trump, the urban, largely suburban women, educated men are leaning towards the candidate, Vice President Biden. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Jim. Dellashon, let's go to you. Detroit is in Michigan, of course, and all of us have been hearing about Michigan in the news lately. There's a lot going on. Fill us in.
Okay, so there is a lot going on, and I'm going to piggyback off what Jim said. You know, in 2016, we were vying with the idea of absentee voting and like no excuse absentee voting. You know, we've been pushing that for quite a while. We finally got that pushed through in 2018. No excuse absentee voting. So what we've seen this year is an increase. We're at 1.9 million votes already submitted, either in person or mail, since October 19th, which is higher. I think it was 1.3 in 2016 for that election. So, you know, and people are still voting. The lines are still long right now. So I predict that that will be record breaking for us here in Michigan. Also, the state officials here and our Secretary of State believes that we will actually exceed our 2008 voters. And, you know, obviously that was a special year, but we're going to exceed that 5 million votes this year, undoubtedly. So that says a lot about how important this election is. And like you said, a lot is going on in Michigan. I could talk about from the north, but we have lawsuits against our Secretary of State right now. By the gun advocates. They want to carry guns into the polling areas after the alleged kidnapping of our governor. This is really important. People are afraid. People are concerned for their safety at the polls. I think that's pushed more people to try to vote early so they're not out there on November 3rd. I know I'll be taking my mother and children. We're actually going to go vote early. So we don't have to deal with it, but the lines are expected to be long on that day. But also the other thing that's happening in Michigan is where you have very populated counties. 25 to 40% of those counties have requested absentee ballots. So we're also seeing voting early, and it's not just it's heavily Democratic counties that are requesting those ballots, but also some of the Republican counties, but overwhelmingly they're expecting more Republicans to vote November 3rd that day.
Excellent, thank you. And I know that the audience will probably have many questions for you about what's happening in Michigan. Tim, let's go to you in New Hampshire, a state that's unique within New England. So what's happening in the live free or die state?
Yeah, so New Hampshire, as many people know, for about 100 years, from 1908 to 2008, was staunchly Republican, and ever since we have become staunchly, I guess, flip-floppers between Democrats and Republicans. And so currently what you're seeing is a slight lead for Vice President Biden in the polls. But it was a very close race, actually the second closest race in 2016, where Hillary Clinton beat President Trump by 0.4 of a percentage point. We are also seeing a lot of interest in absentee balloting. New Hampshire has a lot of older, more vulnerable people, so a lot of them are taking advantage of the opportunity to vote absentee. I think the latest numbers are over 225,000 absentee ballots have been requested in the state, and in 2016 we had 75,000. So there is definitely a big interest in this election and in voting. We probably will continue our schizophrenic streak. Many people are quite happy with our Republican governor, Chris Sununu, but not very happy with the current president and his administration. So we will see how things play out in the coming week.
So let's move on to Kansas City. Matthew, can you give us the update? What's happening in Missouri?
Yeah, hey everybody. Hello from Middle America Barbecue Jazz National World War I Museum and Memorial. Kansas City is such an interesting place because just like Xiao, we're on the border between two states. And while folks might want to lump Kansas and Missouri into the same bucket, they really do function very differently. They have very different characteristics about them. Missouri, for example, does not have any early voting. So there's absentee balloting here, but you have to have an excuse, which means that a lot of folks are sort of pent up, ready to go to the polls next Tuesday. But we really don't know what that's going to mean for wait lines and things like that. Kansas does have early voting. Both states are paying attention this year. We're voting for governor in Missouri. In Kansas, we're voting for a U.S. senator for the longtime Republican Senator Pat Roberts' seat. That race is really interesting because it's between two physicians, including one who switched from being a Republican to a Democrat just a couple years ago. So it's a really interesting race to watch. I will say that both Kansas and Missouri feel far away from Washington, D.C. So there's a general dissatisfaction about what's going on in D.C., but there's a lot of looking at what the policy impacts are here. So I think I'll leave it there, but a lot of interesting things to watch in Middle America.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Let's take a trip over to the West Coast. And I will ask Derrick to jump in. Derrick is in Portland, Oregon today. We know Portland has been in the news a lot, but we also know that Oregon is a state that really primarily does, mail-in voting. So Derrick, what is going on in Oregon?
Sure. Thanks so much, Megan. It's great to be a part of all this discussion. And I think it's really interesting, all of us as nonpartisan organizations, grappling with these issues. A lot of us have had programs to try to help inform our members about some of the different positions candidates. We, for instance, had one on trade and elections and international trade policies. Yeah, I mean, as you note, Oregon is a vote by mail state. This will be the 20th year that we're voting for president by mail. There is no in-person voting. It's all by mail. There are drop boxes all over the place. I dropped my ballot off last weekend at next to the local library. You can also now mail it. You can also mail it in. And in fact, just last year, they made it so that the state pays for the postage. So it is quite easy to vote and also to register to vote. You're the motor voter. It's registration when you're at the DMV. So it's both with a little bit of pride, humor, and a little sadness that we look around and see a lot of other states grappling with these challenges. Because it really is a non-controversial, bipartisan support for voting by mail. In the Portland metro area, as I'm sure you've seen in the news, I mean, there's been a great deal of protests about police accountability and ending systemic racism, and that's a major issue here. And so there's a lot of focus and interest in local elections. Oregon, like Washington and California, has been historically over the last, several presidential cycles a blue state. So there's a lot of focus on local elections in some respect more so than the national because of the trend over the last several years. The last thing I would just say is, I think a lot of us too, as we engage with our members, is to emphasize what a privilege and a right it is to have universal suffrage. Many of us have spent time in developing countries where that is not a right. And I had the chance when I was a Foreign Service officer to observe elections in developing democracies in Latin America. And so it is exciting to see the high percentage of Americans voting this year, what it looks to be, because when you look at a new developing democracy and you see how high the turnout is, it's exciting to see Americans not take this for granted because it truly is a right that we should privilege.
Thank you for reminding us of that, Derrick. It's so true. Let's go to Kentucky and Southern Indiana. Xiao, what is going on in the ground?
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the state of bourbon and horse racing. Unfortunately, neither of those are really prospering right now. You know that we have this saying in that our mayor developed called bourbonism, which is bourbon tourism, and right now that's suffering. It's really, this pandemic has really changed a lot of these tourist and business trade, all of that sphere for us. In terms of the bigger picture, Kentucky is very reliably red, which so it's not up for anything, but we do have a big race. As many know, we have Senator McConnell is coming up, going to be going against Amy McGrath. Earlier on this year, I think that race was somewhat competitive. At this point, I don't think it's one of the most competitive races that people are really looking at, even though there's a lot of activity still happening here. In terms of voting, we have done really well with the voting in terms of access. One of the interesting things about Kentucky, and probably like many other states, is that our governor just elected last year is a Democrat. The Secretary of State is a Republican, but they have been actually working really well together and came up with a very early plan of how the voting process is going to be. So far we have had about 1 million votes cast, and there's so many options. It's still ongoing. So I think the turnout is definitely very good. Some of the really things that's kind of that's on the ground that people are really have been looking at is, of course, healthcare is the biggest issue. Pandemic, Kentucky traditionally has always ranked kind of the lowest of states in health equities and health issues. So this has really kind of brought everything home. But the other issue that we've been kind of grappling with is really the protests around the Breonna Taylor and all the racial justice issues, very much like in Portland. So we have had ongoing protests around that. So police reform, police, brutality, all of these issues are very much a divisive issue right now in Kentucky. So those are all the things that we're kind of looking at, and it's really kind of pitting people very much against each other in those ways. So we have some unique problems, but for the most part, I would say very, very close to what the national concerns are. So I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Thanks, Xiao. And last but not least, we're going to go to the perpetual swing state of Ohio. Patrick, can you tell us what's going on in Columbus?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for your leadership. And yeah, this is the one time of the year or every 4 years when Ohio is looked at. My friends from around the country start to have an interest in what's going on there. Otherwise, they're relatively quiet. And that's because no Republicans ever become president without Ohio. This is why we're seeing a ton of activity here. Bloomberg just put a bunch of money into advertising, and I heard even Mike Pence's nephew has been rallied into going to Ohio. So they're trying to get everyone out there. So that's one. The other is that the polls say that we're in that margin of error, 2% more for Trump, but really in the margin of error, and we're seeing it shift where people are talking about Biden. But the problem is that the polls in 2016 were wrong. So if they're wrong like they were in 2016, then the estimates from some of the national polling is that Trump would again win by 9%. So kind of like a unsurety based on the polls and what you see around. I think what's different this year is the voter enthusiasm, and I'm not sure. It's sort of two-part. One is people are motivated by President Trump, and it's either for good or for bad. But there's also this motivation around the fear of fraud and mail-in delay. So our early voting is twice more than 2 times what it was the last election. So I think for in terms of Ohio and who's going to decide this swing state, I think it's 2 groups. One is the blue collar manufacturing workers in Ohio. If you remember Lordstown, the GM plant that closed, Trump got elected because he promised recovery for a lot of the manufacturing jobs, and that hasn't panned out. So we're going to see who they vote for. And the second is who I call the silent supporters, or the suburbanites, that won't admit to being a Trump supporter because all the urban folks around here seem to be for Biden, and they were for Hillary 4 years ago. So the silent supporters will determine the election.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We know that we run organizations that focus on engagement with the world, and in the run-up to this election, in any of the presidential debates, there wasn't really much mention of foreign policy at all. So I want to ask my counterparts around the country, what are you hearing from your members about their concern? Are they concerned about global issues? And I want to also incorporate a question from one of our colleagues, Wendy from Stanford. How has the presidential race impacted your programming? And so I'm going to start with Tim because I know you have to jump off soon. So Tim, in New Hampshire, what are you hearing from your members about? Are they concerned about global issues? How has it impacted what you're doing as a World Affairs Council?
Yeah, so for us, every 4 years, we have the New Hampshire presidential primary, first in the nation primary. And so we get a lot of interest from our membership in what each candidate has to say. And so I think it was really important for us and heartening for us to see such great turnout when we hosted 8 different candidates, both Republicans and Democrats, for discussions on foreign policy. And the questions that came out were really, really interesting. So it was wonderful to see and hear that there are people who are definitely interested in knowing about the candidates' foreign policy issues. In terms of affecting any of our programming, we've continued on sort of the track and the experiences that we see every 4 years. We do a lot more around top issues that are being talked about in terms of the presidential election. For our membership, a lot of what people are interested in hearing about are nuclear weapons and presidential power around that. Foreign national security and climate change is one of our big issues that we've been talking about this year, as well as rising authoritarianism around the world. So those are really kind of the 3 areas that we've focused on. We've also done a lot on China and US relations. We just did a great program with the World Affairs Councils of America on US-German relations through the Wunderbar Together program. And I think people are also very interested in the coronavirus pandemic, obviously, and how that not only impacts us here in the US, but what role we should be playing around the world.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Tim. Let's go back to you, Jim, not in Dallas, but in Santa Fe.
Well, yeah, our programs have been quite broad, as many of you have seen, ranging, just like yesterday, we did a program on President Washington and his cabinet, to trying to provide programs reaching both sides of the aisle. A few weeks ago, we had Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And I think one of the challenges we've had, and it's interesting that you had such success in getting candidates. In 2016, we were able to have 5 or 6 of the candidates. In this past cycle, we were not successful in getting any, which we found quite interesting. We got some nibbles, but no one came. Our members, obviously, if you write out the check to the World Affairs Council, you are engaged in the world. And we've been having really very strong attendance. I think the issues that people want to see mostly, though, are clearly the impact on the economy and on our society from the pandemic, and China, because of the close, so much trade between Dallas-Fort Worth and Texas and China, the tariffs and the increasing tension between China and the United States has been of paramount interest.
Excellent. Thanks, Jim. Xiao Yin, what are your members thinking? What are you hearing?
So, the global issues that most of our members traditionally have been interested in around trade, some of the big topics that the security topics, regional topics, and the last years has been around climate change and immigration. But I will say the pandemic is really, right now, it's the pre-pandemic and currently, those are very different. And right now, I think the feeling is that the pandemic has really made us, in many ways, hyper-local in how we think about things, because we're so kind of around here, very much limited within how much we can travel, where we can go. And there's a sense that, we don't hear much of any kind of international news in the news here. And that's usually the case, but it's more so right now. That's where I really see World Affairs Councils like us really stepping in to fill that gap, because it's a constant, we have to constantly remind our members and people in the community that, yes, we're currently all pretty much quarantined and limited where we are, but there's a bigger world out there and it's not going away. And eventually this is going to go away and we will start traveling again. So what we've been seeing at our role is really filling that gap, continuing that dialogue on any topic. It could be on the pandemic, it can be on, any issue that people have always cared about. And just kind of making sure that people are aware that there are people around the world and really serving as that connector with people from different countries. We do the visitor program with a lot of exchange, really reaching out to our alums during this time and seeing, connecting them. And I think what has been effective is really these stories, individual stories, rather than the big topics that people can relate to, because that's where we are. We're very personalized and hyper local and wherever we are. So that's how we see this, is that you can't break out of where we are, that situation we're in, until this is over. So what we can do right now is just kind of keep plugging away, like all of you. I get all of everybody's newsletters and just, we're all doing the same thing. We're kind of highlighting, hey, things are still happening, and you want to know what's going to happen because this is going to end at some point.
Thanks, Xiao. One of the things that we always talk about in Connecticut is how globally connected we are. And I can't think of a more unfortunate example of how globally we connected all of us are than COVID-19. I mean, it really is an example of something that could happen, in a small wet market or in Wuhan, China, impacting the entire world. All of us are connected. And that's one of the, as you say, the great roles that World Affairs Councils can play. Let's move back to Kansas City. Matthew, I know that you've been really busy on the ground. So tell us what's going on.
No, there's a lot going on. Yeah, thanks, Megan. And I just to echo my colleagues around the country, I don't think many folks are casting their vote primarily because of foreign policy, right? And we have to expect that. I mean, pocketbook issues are always a reality. But we did just finish an 8-week series in Kansas City called the Choices Election Issues Series, looking at all sorts of topics, tariffs and trade, nuclear proliferation, transatlantic relationship. Megan, we just finished yesterday with American Leadership and Multilateralism with Professor Ona Hathaway from Yale Law School. So a good Connecticut connection there. But really, really interesting to dive in and understand the history and context of these topics, even if they're not going to drive people's votes. I think it's really essential to understand where the candidates come together and where they diverge on these different issues. I would say, just like Jim said, tariffs and trade with China, a huge issue in Kansas and Missouri when we're looking especially at agriculture here, but also refugee concerns is an ongoing topic in Kansas City. Kansas City has a history of being a very, very, very welcoming place. We have thousands of folks from Somalia, from Iraq, from Burma, from Sudan, who live in the Kansas City area. And those numbers have been going down over the past few years. And that has impacted not just the refugees in the area or the ones who aren't here, but it's also affected an ecosystem of supporting organizations in Kansas City that really are ready to give folks a new home. So just a glimpse at what's going on in this area.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Dellashon, let's go to you in Detroit. I know you recently hosted Renew America. So what are you hearing from your members?
Primarily, well, we do think globally because we're obviously a manufacturing state and an agriculture state. I mean, those are our primary, that's our income, that's our economy there. When you think about the agriculture, a lot of it, a big complaint from our, say, blueberry growers, a lot of our blueberries last year in 2019 were imported from Mexico, Peru, Canada, all these other places. And they also received a higher dividend than our growers right here in Michigan. So those are serious complaints that affect their livelihood. So they're very concerned about any trade deals that are being negotiated because it does affect them directly. Manufacturing, the steel, any tariffs that are put on, how are we going to build our cars? And obviously we've got the big three or the two. I can't keep up with what Chrysler's doing right now. But we have our manufacturing plants. So tariffs are obviously very important. And I believe people will vote accordingly to how it's going to directly affect their livelihood. And also where I live, we're on the border of 10 minutes, I'm in Canada. many people here, I have lunch in Canada. I mean, not now, but normally that's a common thing. People cross the border every day. Many of their nurses work here in our hospitals. I have friends that go there to work at institutions there. So those are things that are very concerning for individuals. But mostly I have not done many internationally focused events. That's not really what our community is focused on right now. I did do one on the Middle East to talk about the deal that the president just completed between Israel and Abu Dhabi, that pact. So I did have a speaker. And of course, that's of interest because of the large community we have here from Arab nations that call this area their home. So that obviously was of interest to them. But for the most part, yes, we are focused internationally on borders, but mostly it's small business. People want to know about business taxes and things like that. So that's pretty much focus.
Thanks, Dellashon. Patrick, tell us what you're hearing from your members on the ground. Maybe even from some of your students, right? The voice of youth is often very important.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Like Dellashon, we're neighbors in Ohio, so trade is a big issue. Well, to echo some of the others, people don't think they're focused on foreign policy right now. I mean, they care about jobs, they care about putting food on the table, and they really care about finding hope, because it's really hard to find that now. So I think people are on the ground have that in their minds, but may not realize that those all have global connections. So I think trade was one that I find to be similar to Michigan around our farmers. Half of all soybeans in Ohio are exported, and China's the #1 recipient. And so the trade wars were a big deal, although the farmers got subsidies. So I'm not sure how that'll play out in terms of their election. The second I'd say, and this now goes into our young people, which, we run a global scholars program with 1,200 high school students from 20 districts in our region. Immigration is a hot topic. And I think there's a couple angles. One is we're in the Columbus area, we're growing economically. There's a talent shortage, even with the unemployment that's been happening. There's a talent shortage. We've got the retail industry with folks like Abercrombie and Big Lots. We've got the restaurants. So any of you that like Wendy's or White Castle, those are Columbus based. And all that financial industry, really depends on a lot of the Indian immigrants who come. So there's this desire by the corporate world for talent, which embraces immigration. But then there's also the flip side, where much of the state feels that immigrants take our jobs, or they're afraid of terrorism. We have the second largest Somali population in the U.S. They're on the country that's banned for coming to the U.S. And I think the last part is race and racism, and immigration trends over the last 10 or 20 years in the U.S. Although the levels of immigrants are not quite where they were in the 1910s, it's much browner and blacker. And I think that's caused some, negativity towards immigration. And young voters don't like that. They also don't like separation of families. So that's a hot issue. The other, which tends towards youth, is climate change and broadly sustainability. I think for our 1,200 high school students this year, the #1 issue that they did take action projects on was around climate sustainability. And so that's hot. In terms of how our programming is being impacted, racial justice is probably the biggest impact to our programming, because many see that as a domestic issue. And so we've been figuring out a way to do that through our programming with students. We're embedding, the topic of racism as a global issue into our student programming. Our training on cultural competence will include some focus around implicit bias as part of how to understand our own culture and others. And then our webinar series, like we're doing here, will also have topics around anti-racism, which is our next topic on November 17th. It's global competence and systemic racism, and particularly how international and global educators can be leaders in the progress towards racial justice. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks. So picking up on what Patrick was just saying about trade, let's ask Derrick what is happening in Portland. What are you hearing from your members? I know that you had mentioned that trade is an important part of what you're doing, but what's going on?
Yeah, I thank you. And I think all the West Coast states, I mean, they have great interest in what's going on in Asia and the connection there. And so, as I mentioned, we've done specific programming on that. And like Jim mentioned, that China being such a huge issue for a variety of reasons. I also just want to pick up on what Patrick said. I mean, what a lot of people listening may not realize is how much work World Affairs Councils do with education, and for many of us with international visitors through the State Department. And a lot of that, while not directly involved, of course, with election issues, is very much around like civic engagement and issues that undergird democratic development. And so I think there's been a lot of discussion of those types of issues, whether it's combating systemic racism or issues of homelessness and how that connects and worsens in the COVID crisis. And really just to come full circle, I mean, COVID has dominated really everything that we've done, not only by turning all our programs virtual, but also I know for our council and probably for many others, it's always an aspect of the program that we do. And so, and we've gotten sort of at issues more through that lens, and often questions will come up about, different philosophical or political approaches to solving COVID crisis, or how that impacts our relations with different parts of the world, like China. But it is really all sort of through the lens of COVID, and I don't see that changing post-election. I think that's going to continue until we're able to really get ahead of this, continue to be the overriding concern, and connect, whether that's through jobs or healthcare or other aspects, going to continue to remain a primary aspect of our programming and a key concern for our members.
Excellent, thank you. Tim, I know you have to jump off in just a second, but if you want to ask you right before you go to talk about, the important role that your council plays in the community, especially as we look to whatever the world will look like, post next Tuesday.
Sure, yeah. I think we all play great roles in our community to really help educate people and inform people about these top international issues. As you've heard here, a lot of these issues you may not think are international, but with how globally interconnected everything is these days, obviously jobs and trade and COVID, healthcare, et cetera, they all are impacted and affected by what goes on around the world. So I think by providing the opportunity for people to hear from experts, to better understand complex global issues, to really dive deep into some of these issues. We just did a podcast interview earlier today for our podcast that comes out next week on the history of the US-Arab-Israeli conflict and how that all leads up to today with the new agreements and what that really means. And so I was thinking, we'll talk for 20 minutes. 40 minutes later, we're still going, and I haven't gotten through all of my questions. So I think, you may think that you know what's going on, and you may think that you, just by reading the news, have a good handle on what the issues are. But when you get to engage with experts and really talk to them about the intricacies that you can't fit into a 750-word article, you really get a better understanding of what's going on. So with that, thank you all for taking the time to join us. I really appreciate the invite from our Connecticut partners here. And certainly if you have any questions about exactly what's going on in New Hampshire, happy to answer them offline.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. Thank you for joining us. and hopefully we'll see you soon. I'm gonna mix in a few audience questions here, if that's okay. I have some follow-up for Dellashon and Patrick and anyone else who might want to jump in. Can you talk a little bit about how U.S.-China relations, U.S.-China trade wars has impacted your communities? Do you think, the audience member is asking, do you think it's driven support away from the Trump administration, or do you think did the subsidies increase support for Trump, or is there a mix? What's going on, Dellashon and Patrick?
I'm going to be honest, I don't have the research in front of me on how much trade. I know it's a great deal because I was our county administrator, and Wayne County is the largest in the state of Michigan. My good friend across the street was the actual person in charge of the trade relations. So I know it's there. I don't know the amount at this time, but I will tell you, when I did the Renew America with General Wesley Clark, the questions that were coming in through their chat were very anti-China. And I think everything from attacking Confucius Institutes as being regimes to, infiltrate America. It was just very interesting as I was going through these chats on like, my goodness, we really need to do more. But I think the rhetoric coming from our executive leadership of the country has unfortunately put a stain on people's ideology on our relationship, an unrealistic ideology, with China. So, it hasn't been positive. So, again, on the ground, there's definitely an Chinese sentiment here in Michigan. But again, that doesn't say much. It is Michigan. We're home of the militia of America. So, that's just who we are. Sorry.
Yeah, in Ohio, I'm not sure trade will impact, well, let's just put it this way. There's two components. One is the farmers who have been impacted greatly by the trade war. But as I mentioned earlier, I think the support, the subsidies helped economically. And I think also the rural areas are heavily Trump supporters. So it'd be hard to switch them. I think the manufacturing and blue collar workers would be the ones that I'm not sure about, because in the last election they went Democrat, and the last one they went Republican. Before that was Democrat. So I think it could go either way. So we'll see.
Derrick, I have a question for you from an audience member, and it's about how people in Portland and how people in the state of Oregon feel about the way in which the activism happening in Portland has been politicized nationally. I mean, do you get a sense of what everyday citizens are, how they're feeling about the politicization of what's happening?
Well, there was a lot of controversy, with the use of federal law enforcement around some of the protests near federal buildings, and that was highly controversial. And that has, died down, but then it flared back up when local police were deputized to make arrests on behalf of federal law enforcement, again, for protests around federal buildings. So it is waxed and waned, but it's been a very hot issue. And as I mentioned before, it's been key to a lot of the city of Portland, city council and mayoral races. And there's also a ballot measure on about police oversight reform. So that is really where it's had a lot of effect. And and I would note that some of our other colleagues, other cities, such as Seattle and Chicago and others, have at times been in the national spotlight for that, and of course Philadelphia now, and it just continues to be very hot button issue. I think that's about the best I can say on that, and I would say that probably most people like to get to attacking some of the systemic problems that need to be fixed in locally and nationally, and there's a mix of feelings on what the next steps are on that.
Thanks so much, Derrick. Jim, I'm going to ask you a question that I think is coming from one of your members, or at least someone who is in Texas currently. So looking at the potential of a Biden administration, do you think that, this is strictly foreign policy question, what do you think that the public will have unrealistic expectations about what possibly could happen?
Well, I think clearly those who vote for Biden may have unrealistic expectations, although he has been quite up front, especially in the last few weeks, saying about what are some of the key things that he'll do in his first week in office, first 100 days. He will hopefully, he says, resume negotiations with Iran on the JCPOA. He will seek to re-enter the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, re-enter or withdraw the withdrawal from the World Health Organization. So I think there'll be probably 5 or 6 issues that he'll immediately take action on that perhaps will give his supporters a sense of comfort.
Thanks, Jim. Xiao, this may not be a question you're entirely comfortable asking and answering, and if you're not, that's fine. But someone in the audience wants to know what the general feeling is in your community about Mitch McConnell's leadership.
I think it really depends where you ask them. In the metro areas, it's, Kentucky has maybe 4 major cities, urban areas. 3 of those are very close together, kind of like a triangle. So Louisville, Lexington, Frankfort, and Western Kentucky, Bowling Green, those areas are pretty much, I'm not sure about Bowling Green, but at least those 3 other ones are pretty blue. They're very Democrat leaning, especially in Louisville. And so sometimes when you're out here, it's very anti-McConnell. So you might think that the state is out, but in fact, his support outside of Louisville is very strong. And that's really what's going to probably propel him this time again. The sense is that he's, especially when you get outside of the urban areas, that he's been around, he brings home the pork, whatever you want to call them. He's been doing that for a long time. And there's always a suspicion of new people coming into that role. And but there's also people who are much more, I don't want to say truly informed, but people who have a bigger view have said that, at least in terms of foreign policy, he hasn't been that forward with a lot of the foreign policy issues, really didn't take a leadership role in terms of where they stand. And many people have said that, Amy McGrath, because of her background in the Air Force, that she would probably have a much better position on foreign policy representing the U.S. and Kentucky. So there's all those views, but I'm comfortable in saying that McConnell has strong support outside the major metro areas, but inside the metro areas, he's not very popular at all.
Thanks, Xiao. Matthew, I have a kind of a 2-part question for you. Both questions very different. Someone wanted you to expand a little bit about the importance of refugee issues as driving the community. Do you see community support or rejection for anti-refugee issues? And then someone else wanted to know, do you foresee Missouri being a battleground state?
It's so interesting. So I think what a lot of our colleagues have pointed to, Megan, is a growing divide between urban and rural in the United States. And I really think that going forward, this is going to be a major impediment for the unity that we would love to see, right? We would love to come together nationally, but there are just such different issues and such different perceptions of those issues. And I think the refugee issue is definitely one of those. There is considerable support in the Kansas City metropolitan area, not just for refugees, but for international connectivity. We have more than 50 or 60 languages spoken in the Kansas City, Missouri public school system. I mean, we've just got a lot of international connections, not to mention the trade and business aspects of things. But when you get out into the rural areas and you're talking to folks who live on their own and they're more isolated. There's a lot, and I think this is where the mission of our councils comes in, right? How do we help people to connect on a personal level? How do we have that person-to-person diplomacy? How do we help people to understand the issues that are, in the case of refugees, what are the push factors that are pushing folks out of their home, to understand that people don't just get up and go because they feel like it, but there are actual causes that are pushing them out of where they're from. So I think that's important. I don't see Missouri as a battleground state this year. I think Kansas has surprised us in the past. I think that Kansas many Kansans are moving into more urban areas right now, and so that's a population shift that's worth watching. I think Missouri will stay where it has been in the recent past.
Excellent, thank you. We are running out of time, but I'm going to do a little speed round to ask all of you to give wrap us up here. So why is civil society really important? What is at stake if people remain disengaged? Dellashon, let's start with you.
Right, thanks, Megan. What's really important, I think, in a civil society is transparency. Being able to have a public debate, everyone participating, and just good governance and trust. I need to be able to trust that the leaders we elect are operating not only on my behalf, but on the country's behalf, because every state needs something different, and I absolutely understand that. But I think we do need to find a common ground that we can all get on board to move forward. But I think that's absolutely essential, trust for civil society. Thanks.
Thanks, Della. Thank you. Derrick?
Well, I just want to build off what Matthew said. Is I think we need to continue to be able to reach out to a more diverse, wider audience so that we can help to build that trust that Dellashon was talking about, and to have those reasoned debates. And so whether that's diversifying the audience, that in an urban area that connects with a World Affairs Council, or it's to reach out through this virtual way that we can now to people throughout our states who may not be able to come to Metro Center for a talk. I mean, I think there are opportunities that we can use to try to bring in new perspectives, new voices that will hopefully help build some of that sort of civic engagement and working together.
Thanks, Derrick. Jim?
I made reference a few minutes ago about that debate that I was involved with last week. And Frank Luntz asked the audience, how many of you have lost a friend or have not been able to communicate in the same way with a family member in the last 3 or 4 years? And there was a majority who had a show of hands. And so, this shows that it's so important for us at the World Affairs Council to provide a safe space. And I think that's really what we do so well. And we do it through our educational programs, through the high schools. And it's just essential at this time that we get away from, sadly, what has been termed and described as identity politics, to where people can disagree, but to find that in so many ways, we are so close to building a consensus.
Thank you. Patrick?
Yeah, I think the civil society is extremely important in a democracy. You've got business is driven by profit motives. Government is often driven by politics more than it is service. So the independent sector, or the NGOs and nonprofits that make up civil society, are really underpinning of a democracy for two reasons. One is that's how groups' voices are heard. And second, it's how we ensure that the values that undergird our democracy are kept. I mean, I think this year in particular, looking at the elections and the worry that will there be fraud by international folks? Will the president allow a smooth transition of power? Are voter rights being upheld? Those are democratic issues that are upheld by civil society. And I think if we don't maintain that part of the three-legged stool of our democratic community, then we're in trouble.
Thank you. Xiao?
There we go. Yeah, I would say I agree with Patrick. I think one of the things about civil society is just at a macro level that it really fills a lot of gaps that government and other sectors are not able to do. Especially now, I think we all see that the politics has been so divisive in the last couple of years that many things are just left. You can't have any consensus on many of the issues and how to deal with them at this local level. So that really leaves the civil society to be much more responsive in that way. But I would say more specifically, what we do as a network at the World Affairs Council is kind of like what Jim has mentioned, is really providing that space and making people realize that we are not in a bubble. It's a constant struggle for many communities, some states like ours, where we have to remind people that even though you may not travel, that globally, the global community is actually within our communities. As Matthew and many have said, we have our population is not, heterogeneous in any way. We have over 100 different languages spoken in our schools, and it's not there anymore. It's really here. And I think our role is really to keep on reminding people about that and help them realize what the implications of are. So I would say this election especially is important because depending on who is going to be in executive office, that foreign policy and our relationship with the world is really going to be very different. And in terms of how people respond to us as Americans is going to be very different.
Thanks, Cheyenne. Matthew, ready to close it out?
Gosh, in 10 seconds, very, very quickly. And so what a pleasure to be with all of you today, and what a robust conversation. Thank you so much. We live in a soundbite culture, and I think it is imperative that we carve out the space and time to do deep dives into these issues in a soundbite culture. And we have to check ourselves to make sure that we are not just repeating the sound bites that come into us. That's number one. Number two, I think we don't have to agree, as we've said today, but we do have to find a way to listen, to understand, and to be comfortable with the discomfort, which is so difficult, but it comes through asking substantive, meaningful questions and checking our visceral reactions on things. And finally, I think that there is huge value in understanding history, context, and parallel examples. We have to move away from black and white and even shades of gray, and we have to see the world in full color, because that is the world that really exists.
Thank you, everybody. Every day I come to work and I'm grateful to be part of this network. And I know everyone out there listening knows why, even more so now. I have such respect and admiration for all of you here today and everyone else around the country. It is not easy to be a nonprofit leader at this time. And it's not easy to be doing what we're doing. And all of you are doing it at such an exceptional level. So thank you to everyone for being on this call today. I'm so grateful, and thank you for sharing, your view of what's happening in your communities.
I'll just echo Megan to say a huge thank you to all of the council leaders who joined in today. We so appreciate your time and sharing your perspective and leadership from across the country. We also are so grateful to everyone who joined in the conversation today. Thank you so much for being here. I want to, before we sign off, put in a plug for everyone. If you're seeing another council from across the country, please go ahead and check out the programs that councils are doing. Everyone has some fantastic programs coming up. In particular, I believe Jim out of Dallas, Texas, has a program coming up tomorrow with Fareed Zakaria, which should be a fantastic one. I also want to put a plug in.
Just go to our website at dfwworld.org and sign up for Fareed Zakaria. Thanks so much.
It's going to be a real good one. I also want to put a plug in for our YouTube channel. If you'd like to revisit this conversation, the full recording will be up on our YouTube channel. It's World Affairs Council of Connecticut. If you subscribe and like, you can get notifications and make sure that you don't miss any of the future conversations. Or you can check out some of the past conversations that are up there right now. Most of all, I want to say thank you again. We hope everyone's doing well. And most importantly, everyone is going to be voting next week. So thank you again. And until next time.
Thanks, everyone.